Thank you very much, Gary. Thank you for that kind introduction. I appreciate it. It's terrific being here with everybody here this morning. You know, one of the great thinkers of the 20th century said, life is either a thrilling adventure or it's nothing at all. And God, I love that. So let's talk about the migration to electric transportation as a thrilling adventure, and I honestly believe that it is. And here's why. It's one of the very few places in which an enormous industry has the potential to be dominated by good guys. So when you look at the American consumer and you ask, well, how well is the typical American served by the largest industries in the United States, you see a horror story. You see our kids being made fat and unhealthy with fast food. You see the oil industry dominating the transportation and energy sectors more generally. I won't comment on those who build war machines except to say that I'm glad I'm not one of them. And do you realize what 8 million school kids do every morning? They take a hit of Ritalin. They're on an extremely powerful psychoactive drug. And I'm of the opinion that that's not a good thing for 8 million kids and their families. And I'm also certainly not convinced that you need to talk to your doctor to see if you have, restless fingernail syndrome or something like that. I don't think that the pharmaceutical industry in general, they make money very well. I'm not sure they do much else very well. But here, as I say, here the good guys just have a chance to win, and I'm excited about that. I think of that as a thrilling adventure. But who can explain the disparity between the various things that we see every day? Here we have the International Energy Agency predicting 100 million EVs on the road by 2050. And by the way, this kind of mirrors my own projection in terms of what's going to happen, but and we'll get more into that in a second. But here we have the Wall Street Journal talking about how EVs are overhyped and are probably not going to measure into our future in any meaningful way. Now, I would also ask you, how often do these predictions come true anyway? In other words, if you're looking at Booz Allen or McKinsey or Deloitte or Boston Consulting, and you look at these super smooth adoption curves, are there any case studies in which they've been accurate? I can't find one. Certainly, if you look at where nobody predicted that there'd be 5 billion cell phones in the world right now, if you looked at this thing 10 years ago. And when you live through the internet explosion as we all did, we noticed that this was very jagged. In other words, we thought this was going to go through the roof, and year after year it kind of bumped along, and one year it did take off. But I defy anybody to be able to predict the future with any more degree of certainty than those types of phenomena. So what I would like to do is just kind of talk. Maybe I'll even go so far as to say that I'd like to ramble for a few minutes and talk about various vectors associated with electric transportation, and some of which militate toward great adoption curves, other would be a little bit more cautious. But I think these are the vectors, if you will, that we should all know and kind of appreciate going forward. First of all, I believe, not everybody agrees with me, but I believe that EVs are 100% necessary unless we're going to become an agrarian society, which we're not. So in other words, if we're going to deal with the upcoming shortages in energy and food and ultimately with water, and which, nobody doubts the imperative to do this, historically, energy is extremely closely tied to GDP, and so if we want robust economic growth, or at least stability, we need to handle the energy issue. In fact, at the bottom I say that if we want sustainability generally, that is implied by, in other words, we will not have it without national security, we will not have that without energy security, and that means weaning ourselves off oil, and that means electric transportation. There are other imperatives, there are other ways of looking this at as well. We're all aware that we're spending $250 billion a year, by some estimates. By others is closer to 500 billion or 700 billion, in dealing with healthcare issues and dealing with the fact that our lungs are damaged through lung cancer and asthma and so forth with the aromatics of oil. We're also aware of the fact that, depending on how you look at this thing, we're very close to the point of peak oil. I think that we're past that point, but it can be argued in a number of different ways. But that's an important point, i.e., that we're simply running out of this. That we have found the inexpensive oil. We haven't found all the oil, but we found the inexpensive oil. And from here, in terms of shale oil and tar sands, it gets expensive in more ways than one. And then you see various other things here. I normally don't bring up global climate change anymore, just because in a crowd the size of this, there are going to be a few deniers, and that's fine with me. I don't argue the point. I do agree with the vast majority of climate scientists that say we have a problem of dire consequence here. But I don't, if you don't believe that, that's fine. Just pick one of the 6 or 8 other different reasons to get rid of foreign oil and go from there. Ocean acidification, by the way, is something that virtually no one doubts. The fact that we're damaging our fragile ecosystems, oceanic ecosystems, with the remnants, the exhaust from burning fossil fuels. Okay, so I hope I've made the point that we need electric vehicles. But who's we? The truth is, it's not the people sitting in this room. In other words, first of all, the progressive political wing is dead, as you can see from this. Chris Hedges is one of the most brilliant far left-wing political activists you'll ever find. Extremely articulate, erudite guy, and his whole thesis is that we've lost, or they've lost, and certainly. You have the other side of the political spectrum, in other words, the right wing, only in the U.S. it turns out, but whatever, views clean energy as effectively made the point that clean energy has far more job-killing features than it has job-creation features, which is untrue, but they have apparently made that point fairly convincingly with a great number of their constituents. It is true, regardless of where you stand politically, that we're not doing very much at all with respect to renewables. We still have under 2% penetration of renewables in our electric grid mix, if you discount hydroelectric dams. And this is moving along very, very slowly. You also have the fact that there legitimately are technologic issues. In other words, it's true that we're close to grid parity with wind and, to a lesser degree, some of these other technologies, but not when you throw in storage. It is true that you have a deep recession in which you have investors sitting on trillions of dollars on the sidelines. And it's also true that from a political standpoint, you have great uncertainty. In other words, the only thing that we do well in Washington, D.C. is polarize people into 2 camps. You either say there's absolutely no problem with drill baby drill, which is, of course, fallacious, or you say we got to get off oil this afternoon, which is equally ludicrous. So there is no centrist, well-reasoned position here. Also, we're in an election year. I argue we're always in an election year, but that doesn't. My point here is that this makes this whole political thing that much more intense. You also have the fact that, believe what you will, the oil industry employs 7,000 lobbyists. It's the largest lobby in the known universe. Regardless of what you impute about these people morally, if you want to call them evil, or you want to call them pragmatic or whatever, that's fine. Don't call them idiots, because they're not. They're very smart, and they wouldn't employ 7,000 lobbyists if they weren't exacting favors from them in terms of creating a playing field that favors them. Here's another set of vectors on this thing. Electric vehicle naysayers point to a great number of interesting points. One is range anxiety. In other words, we in the United States have drivers who have historically demanded absolute freedom in where they go and when they go there. They're risk averse. I can understand that somebody doesn't want to plunk down $30,000 for the automotive version of a Betamax machine. They're unwilling to pay extra. In other words, the fact that this investment comes up front and the savings come over a long term is something that consumers are historically unwilling to do. And then you have the issue that what drives electric vehicle purposes? If you can't offer a value proposition that makes sense to people in terms of dollars and cents, you're probably not going to get the job done, because especially in this recession, investors or consumers are unwilling to invest in something that has ecologic benefits, even to the degree that the fact that they can be shown they have ecologic benefits. Okay, another set of this thing that makes this even more complicated, and that is the fact that if you put yourself in the position of Big Auto, you can say, okay, well, there is a divorce going on between Big Auto and Big Oil, and we can understand that. There have been some near-death experiences in auto, and in fact some death experiences that have caused this divorce. But to a degree, they're sitting on the sidelines. Let's put it this way, they're hedging their bets in terms of how many of these to build and how aggressively to do so. Carlos Ghosn, the CEO of the Renault-Nissan Alliance, I think is probably the most credible spokesperson for the auto industry on the planet. According to him, and I've heard him speak a number of times, he's going for this. He believes in this as a long-term push, but that he goes, this is the second most important imperative I have. The first one's conserving cash, and if I don't do that, I'm not going to be able to have a second or third most important imperative. So it'll be interesting to see what happens here. It's certainly true that regardless of what Ghosn and his people say, there is no real incentive for the auto industry to do this. Obviously, there's no incentive for the oil companies to do this, but when you look at it, the auto industry has gone, or is in the process of going, from a situation in which they could sell a new, Buick or whatever to a customer every 2 or 3 years, to one in which they're selling something now that goes, 500,000 miles before it needs so much as a tune-up. So that's going to a degree, interrupt the kind of relationship that Big Auto has with its customers, and thus the incentive there. So let's get into this issue of what is the value proposition that you can offer consumers? And here's the thing about consumer adoption that I would notice. The number one reason for electric vehicles is to save on gas. The number 2 reason has things to do with the environment, and that's good, but it's a distant second. And now, of course, this may change next week. There could be a new announcement, a new upturn or downturn in the environment. There could be some new announcement with respect to the grave danger in which we find ourselves in terms of the environment. Who knows? But for right now, the number one reason, outside of the first few thousand early adopters who buy an EV simply because it's the right thing to do, if you can't tell them how they're going to save money on this thing, you're probably in trouble. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, here's another aspect that is signified by that mink over there that you see, and that is that when I was a little boy, my mother used to go to her dinner parties with her fashionable friends dressed in mink. And that was the early 60s. I'm going to say that was probably 62, 63. I was 7 or 8, and I noticed this. And I also noticed that a year later, those minks were gone. You couldn't find a mink. And it's because very, very quickly, consumer sensibilities had completely changed. People had realized, pretty much everybody had realized, that this was an unnecessary and completely brutal practice, raising and executing minks just so we could have nice, fluffy coats. And anybody who didn't understand that a year later, and who was stupid enough to wear a mink, was regarded as a Cruella de Vil, as a social pariah. Now, I would argue that it's possible, it's not definite, but it's possible that something similar will happen with respect to electric transportation, and the fact that as we add more, electric transportation isn't the promise of clean transportation, but it's the opportunity for it. And the degree to which we can have more clean energy in our grid mix, that's precisely what we'll have. So I would argue that there are going to be people, there's a possibility that there's going to be an enormous change in sensibility and kind of regard for this point. I would also say that this is, I'll skip that second one and go to the third. Things happen very, very quickly here in 2011. And that I would suggest that it wasn't very long ago that you rented videos and you bought music on CDs in a CD store. But that has gone away almost entirely over a very few years. And my question is, what happens when green is cool? In other words, when there's a kind of quantum shift in people's regard for the importance of being ecologically friendly, it's all bets are off when that happens. And I'll tell you what, if I were hired to come up with a way to sell EVs to Americans, I would press this patriotism button hard. There's nothing more patriotic that you can do than to help get your country off its kind of beholden situation vis-a-vis foreign oil. We're empowering the terrorists. We're prosecuting wars to keep supply channels open for oil. We're borrowing $1 billion a day in a world in which we're all in a quandary about what to do about our national debt. Over a period of a couple decades, we've gone from supreme international respect and admiration, and we've lost that. And I remember not Patton himself, but George C. Scott, the actor who portrayed Patton in that great movie, and when I was a kid, I guess 1970 or something, who said, I'll try to do even in the accent, America loves a winner and will not tolerate a loser. And so we are certainly on the way to, we're only 8 or 10 years from becoming the second greatest economic power on earth behind China. I wonder what it's going to be like for Americans to wake up one day and go, we screwed up in a very short period of time. What happened? So patriotism is the way I would sell this. Here are a few other considerations that go to amplify why I believe that this is going to change very, very quickly, and that they're kind of hidden monkey wrenches in the works that could change this. All of a sudden, you don't need more than, as I say, if you have 200,000 EVs on the road that provide 5 gigawatt hours of electrical storage on the grid in a kind of vehicle-to-grid mode, this is a huge boost for renewables insofar as it's solved to whatever degree the storage problem that plagues the issue of intermittency. So that's an interesting thing to think of. And then check this out. What happens? Obviously, the oil companies are doomed, but nobody knows when. But my question is, what happens when there are 230 million cars and trucks on the U.S. roads right now? What happens when half of them are electric? And the demand for gasoline is dwindling daily. So this will be an interesting, but I don't think a very pretty fight when an organization that size goes down. It's not going to be smooth. So there you go. Here's another couple of things I'd like to point out. In April, there were 400, I guess they were pretty much all Nissan Leafs, probably a combination of Leafs and plug-in conversions and Volts probably, all of which got 220-volt chargers in their garages, and all of which needed the inspection of San Diego Gas and Electric. Well, here are people who are expecting a 3 to 5 day business turnaround, where they were plagued with faced with 4, 5, 6 weeks. So this is something that needs to get dealt with. Here's another thing that I find interesting is that the utilities. Yeah, the utilities are starting to pay attention to this thing, but not nearly to the degree to which you would think. I was in an airport bar at San Francisco about a year ago, I'm guessing, and I was sitting next to somebody, and in my typical fashion, I extended my hand and asked the guy, who he was, what he was doing. And he worked for he was a fairly senior guy at the local utility. And I said, well, tell me what you're doing with respect to EVs. And he goes, we're just starting to look at that. We haven't really thought about it very much. And I'm thinking to myself, that's unbelievable. So I think it's particularly unbelievable given that this is all good. There's nothing bad associated with a slow, looks like it's going to be a slow and steady migration to electric transportation. You have the sales of off-grid power at 3 o'clock in the morning, which now is worth less than nothing to you. And you have steady long-term growth in not only revenue and earnings, but also respect. In other words, you're now providing, you're doing what the gasoline industry did for 100 years. I would think that'd be pretty exciting. Now, here's another, as I say, another kind of aspect on this, and that is energy storage. So there are people, as I'm sure you're aware, looking at compressed air energy storage and pumped hydro, and to a lesser degree, I suppose, batteries. They're good. We'll come to this in a second, but they're battery technologies that have the promise to ultimately be cost-effective in storing decent-sized amounts of utility-scale electrical storage. But where does this fit into the world in which you have extremely specific, though varying, regulation across the various asset categories? You have generation, you have transmission, you have distribution, and you have load, and you're in one of those four categories. Well, what happens when you have somebody who wants to have a multi-billion-dollar asset that is, say, pumped storage or something like that? Obviously, it helps everybody. It helps shave the peaks in terms of electric distribution and consumption. It's good for everybody, but who exactly should? How do you get the people who benefit from that to take that benefit to pay for it? It's an extremely complicated thing, made worse by what I refer to as Byzantine regulation. I was speaking with somebody at the energy storage show the other day who said, what he explained, I couldn't understand. It might have been in Chinese, that was for all it meant to me. And I asked him to explain this thing, and he goes, it don't feel bad if you don't get this. It took me years to figure this out. In places like Texas, it's actually fairly straightforward. In places like California, it's ridiculous. It was put together by a few organizations who profited greatly by the way, the kind of Byzantine way in which this thing was strung together, but it makes no sense, and it's very difficult for everyone. So, okay. Having said all this, here are another couple of points that I'd like to make. One is that I do see, obviously there's a mix of good and bad and strength and weakness in here, but I do see a lot of low-hanging fruit. I see a lot of, for instance, I see that there are 25 million multi-car, 2 or 3 or 5 car households in single-family dwellings with a garage. Now, I understand that there are lots of cars and trucks on this road who don't have the luxury of being an extra car, so that somebody goes, well, I'm one of the 78% of Americans who drives less than 40 miles a day, so an EV makes a great deal of sense to me, but every once in a while I like to go see, grandma halfway across the country. How am I going to do that? Well, you're going to take your wife's car, your husband's car, your kid's car, or whatever. So in a lot of cases, and not in all cases, this isn't right for everybody, but it's certainly right for those 25 million places, and that's a lot. By the time we get to an infusion of 25 million EVs on the road, a heck of a lot will have changed about an awful lot of additional facets of this thing, running into a natural limit, which I believe to be not only aircraft, but probably Class 8 trucks. It's going to be a very long time until we can electrify all of our transportation. But that doesn't scare me. The fact that, the fact that 78% of Americans drive less than 40 miles a day goes back to the question, is it right for everybody? No, but it's right for 78% of us, so that'll keep us out of trouble for quite a number of decades as we get through all this. Now, I talk to people every day running To Green Energy the way I do. People send me their business plan, they send me their kind of career interest or their resume, and they say, what do you think, where are the opportunities? And if they're interested in electric transportation, I point them to, well, what is going to happen? Just step back for a minute and try to understand the kind of macro changes that are associated with how we're moving from an old economic model that's centered around gasoline, internal combustion engines that required a lot of maintenance, to a new one which requires electricity, almost no maintenance, but a lot of very interesting services, some of which are included in the subject of telematics that you see there. So in other words, the information, the kind of IT, the kind of two-way flow of information from the grid to the consumer in the context of electric transportation. Lots of that, just an enormous amount of opportunity there over a period of time. In addition, there are obviously peripheral markets, electric generation itself, smart grid communications, which include, as I say, just think of any two-way communications between the source and the consumer of electricity. You have various issues having to do with efficiency. You have demand response. You've got V2G. I have a friend, I guess it's a friend of a friend, who has sent me a wonderful business plan having to do with the use of school buses. When you think about how you want to plug in electric vehicles into the grid, you think about where it can make a difference and where are there vehicle types that have large amounts, instead of a couple tens of kilowatt hours on board, they've got hundreds of kilowatt hours on board, and they're used in extremely predictable ways for short periods of the day. So this guy has a real brilliant idea with respect to school buses. So obviously that's one of only many. It's only one of many, so we'll see where that goes. Now, here's another thing having to do with billing services. This is totally up in the air, but this is going to get very interesting for you people who speak in terms of IT and communications and networking and basic business math. And that is putting together the infrastructure whereby all of this gets integrated across city or state or country boundaries, or even within one small area. How do you pay for your charge becomes a very interesting thing. You can obviously ask people to prepay, but that's not good for the consumer, and it's really not good for you because it destroys the relationship you can have in terms of CRM, customer relationship management. You want to know who these people are. You want to be part of their lives. You can bill them, and that enables CRM, but it requires credit risk and also expense. In either case, I'm reminded of the fact that when I used to fly back east, we don't have an awful lot of toll roads out here, but we got a lot of them back east. And I still rent cars out of Dulles and drop them off at JFK or whatever. And it wasn't that many years ago that what they call Easy Pass, in other words, the kind of IR device that figures out who you are and debits an account so you can just drive right through toll booths. That they had that years ago, but it was they hadn't. DC and Virginia and Maryland hadn't integrated it with the states going north. So you had to get a different Easy Pass by the time you went from, I guess, Delaware into Pennsylvania, which obviously is awkward. So they fixed that, but here we are. I mean, that was only a couple of years ago. So my point is, an enormous amount of work has to be done to get us to the next level there. In terms of EV charging, this is an interesting area of business, though I don't think it's for the faint of heart. EV charging obviously does the grid connect, it does balance load, it does perform smart charge. You say, it has the potential to charge your car at the right time, determined by time of use rates and what's best for all concerned. It also does certification and authentication. You've got, if you have a 30 kilowatt hour battery at $600 a kilowatt hour, you've got an $18,000 asset. You really don't want to be plugging it in just anywhere where it could be damaged. But here's an interesting thing, that when I say this isn't for the faint of heart, a guy I interviewed for my last book from EPRI, the Electric Power Resource Research Institute, told me this story about Tokyo, how when they first wanted to figure out how are people going to react to electric drive in Tokyo, just as an experiment. So they put chargers on one side of the city, and they noticed that people would be very cautious about where they'd go, and range anxiety happened in a big way, and they wouldn't really let their state of charge go down under about 60 or 55% because they were just simply afraid of getting stranded. Then a couple of years later, they put a whole another bank of chargers on the other side of the city, and what they noticed was now everybody was very comfortable. So you got people going down to 20 and 15% state of charge, but as it turns out, the chargers on the other side of the city were almost never used. So in other words, they existed to provide comfort for the driver, but I'm sure glad I wasn't one of the investors who said, "Oh, let me be a part of one. Let me own one of these things and see how quickly I can get my money back selling electricity at X cents a kilowatt hour." It would have taken forever. So that's a story. What is that a story of? I guess it simply explains that the actual demographics and psychographics of these things are yet to be determined. In other words, you can buy a McDonald's and you can sell Big Macs. McDonald's, I'm not, as I mentioned, I'm not nuts about the fast food industry, but they're sharp enough to know that if they sell you one of these things, it is going to succeed. The same point can't be made about EV charging stations. Now, here's another thing that I want to point out is that there are positive factors that you can see there that are driving or will be driving the cost per kilowatt hour down. Lithium ion in the not too distant future will be under $300 a kilowatt hour, and that's good. We say, I think kind of glibly, that there's no magic bullet. I'm not sure of that. I know that there are a great number of technologies under development. Some people I know at a company back east called EOS are working in zinc air and are going to be launching their product in 2012 at $165 a kilowatt hour. So that really is a game changer in a great number of respects, not only in terms of electric transportation, but in terms of utility grid storage. So that's an interesting perspective there. I should talk about other charging solutions. Here's what I think about this just quickly. Better Place, Shai Agassi, incredible guy, fantastic presenter, has a wonderful solution in terms of, which is largely battery swapping. He basically says, look, I don't want the user, the driver, to worry about charging. I will make sure that wherever he goes, if he pays me X cents a mile, I'll make sure he has a charge. And a lot of this obviously has to do with battery swapping because we don't have ubiquitous fast charging. If you want to drive from here to grandma's halfway across the country, you are going to have to, he suggests that you pull into a station which robotically dismantles the battery out of the bottom of your car, and a couple minutes later you drive off with a nice fresh one. Well, I think this is wonderful. He sold this successfully in Israel. He's Israeli. And I believe he sold this successfully in Denmark. But this doesn't make sense in the United States. Our landmass, 3.5 million square miles, is just not amenable to tens of thousands of these battery swapping places all over this landmass. This does, however, go to show how powerful. I only wish I had the prowess as a public speaker as he or any of his people. I've heard numerous people from Better Place talk, and I'll tell you what, they can make you believe this. But I mean, this simply doesn't pencil out as far as I can see. Fast charging, in other words, what we refer to as level 3, 480 volts and a couple hundred amps. That can give you, if you own a Leaf, say 24 kilowatt hours, can charge that in 15 minutes, I think. I can't remember, but it's roughly that. We are decades away from ubiquitous fast charging. I think we're going to get there. I do see that this is what's probably going to happen here in the United States. Our gas stations, interestingly enough, are wired with 480 volts. So just simply the replacement of those pieces of real estate from gasoline to electricity wouldn't be an unheard of proposition. I see, just briefly in the few minutes I have remaining here, I see charging at home in semi-private locations like the workplace will account for most of charging over the next 10 years, to be augmented over time with places like shopping malls and movie theaters and so forth. But again, there's no real imperative to have ubiquitous charging, insofar as the low-hanging fruit here really are the second and third cars of multi-car families in places that have garages. Now, obviously, you've got apartments with garages under them and so forth, so it'll be an interesting mix, but my point is that we don't need chargers all over the place in the next 10 years. So briefly, I've divided time into three epochs, if you will. So in the next 4 years, early adopters will be buying these things. Fleets are doing a wonderful job, I'm delighted to say, of going onto the bandwagon here, which will prove to the world, even people who are technology laggards, that EVs are ready to go. This will give way to a period of time where you'll see real evidence of hockey stick growth. That, by the way, is the world's largest hockey stick, and it happens to be in Canada, of all places. And then finally, I predict rapid and smooth EV adoption over the decade that follows. I do believe that, not that there isn't technology associated with oil extraction, because there is, but EV powertrains are pure technology, and to a degree, people talk all the time about the degree to which Moore's law applies here. So this is the idea that the efficacy of technology improves exponentially over time. And it was certainly true of the semiconductor industry from the mid-70s and continues to be true today. It applies to a lesser degree to power and energy, but I think we'll see an extremely impressive curve of improvement of technology and cost reduction over a period of time. There's no reason that we can or shouldn't. When you think of the hundreds of thousands of the world's brightest people who are working on solving these problems, I see it in our future. Here, another quick thing, a couple of things in closing. I say keep your eye on France. I read an article the other day that put France way down at the bottom, or a distant third in terms of this. The French are brilliant with respect to this, and they're making a huge effort. I expect them to lead the way over the coming decade with respect to technology, EV technology, and its adoption. I expect a surprise announcement from Toyota. I don't know anything about this except to say that the world is very impressed with what Toyota's done with the Prius over the last 11 years, but their current plans for a plug-in Prius are a snooze. It's going to have, I'm thinking, 7 kilowatt hours, which is a battery-only range of about 12 miles. So, and it's not ready yet. It won't be on the streets for another year. The concept of telling your customers that you want them to both plug in their car and fill it up, and you'll give them a battery-only range of 12 miles is ludicrous. So I don't believe that a company of that stature doesn't have something better under its belt. And when I say it's the worst of all possible worlds, I simply mean that you have two drivetrains. So you have an electric drivetrain that you have to plug in and maintain to whatever degree, but you also have an internal combustion engine. So, and I'm not saying that plug-in hybrids are bad, but if you want one, you have to give the consumer a better bargain. This is just simply a non-starter. So I have to think that a company of that size and stature has something better up its sleeve that you're going to hear about soon. I hope so. You will also see a heightened interest in renewable energy. So through whatever means, through whatever news stories, people are going to be waking up and realizing that, especially we in the United States, have done a terrible job by all accounts with this. We've sat on the sidelines. We have no energy policy. We have no federal renewable portfolio standard. We're a million miles away from having one. We make a joke of ourselves when we show up at meetings like Copenhagen and Cancun. We give $5 or $6 in subsidies to oil and coal for every dollar we give renewables. We will not take a stand on looking at, and certainly not internalizing, the externalities of fossil fuels. Nobody is even thinking about asking for the producers and consumers of oil and coal to pay for the enormous healthcare and long-term environmental damage expenses. We tell everybody that we're concerned about our national debt, and we argue about it vociferously, but we seem to be doing precious little about it. We're all concerned about unemployment, but we're not doing a very good job at realizing that there'll be a minimum of 3 green-collar jobs for every brown-collar job that's lost when we do this. And we don't really put the kibosh on an oil industry that employs 7,000 lobbyists whose job is to extract favors for them at the expense of you and me. So what do I see here? I see an election campaign in which every credible campaigner will have something to say on this. Most of it, in my cynicism, I think most of it's going to be disingenuous, but it's going to be what's going to be required of people. Until we have effective campaign finance reform, this is going nowhere. We have right now, as you can see on twogreenenergy.com, I write about this, and my guest bloggers are good about writing about this too, but there's a ton more at movetoamend.org. Our democracy has been steadily eroded over a period of time, and it took an enormous and perhaps lethal hit in January of 2010 when the U.S. Supreme Court voted in this case, Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, to grant corporate personhood. In other words, to grant corporations the right of protection under the First Amendment of free speech to spend as much money as they want in political advertising. They can spend, ExxonMobil can spend $85 billion next year making sure that candidate A wins and candidate B loses. So this has singularly destroyed our democracy and will until the good people of the United States get behind movetoamend.org. So that's pretty much the size of it. I want to thank you all for having me here today. And I'd like to close with a poem. I figured I'd be the only speaker here today with a poem, so I thought this was a good idea. And this one goes to the point here is that we can think we know what's going on here, and we can take these vectors and we can come up with some pretty good levels of understanding of the EV market and the probable adoption curve. But at the end of the day, what do we have here? We have here, you in this room are listening to me. I'm listening to people whose voices I read, and it's perfectly possible that none of us have a real ironclad grasp on the subject, and that maybe after all this I really have raised more questions than I've provided answers. So here's this poem. It's called "Please, Mrs. Butler." It's written by Alan Alberg. Please, Mrs. Butler, this boy Derek View keeps copying my work, miss. What shall I do? Go sit in the hall, dear. Go sit in the sink. Take your books on the roof, my lamb. Do whatever you think. Please, Mrs. Butler, this boy Derek Drew keeps taking my rubber, miss. What shall I do? Keep it in your hand, dear. Hide it in your vest. Swallow it if you like, love. Do what you think best. Please, Mrs. Butler, this boy Derek Drew keeps calling me rude names, miss. What shall I do? Lock yourself in the cupboard, dear. Run away to sea. Do whatever you can, my flower, but don't ask me. Thanks very much, everyone.